That's crazy.
Please hold while this loads. Brilliant. Welcome to CT. CT today is about structure. Really unfortunately for everyone involved, we all need to do it. It's not very fun, but we're going to do it anyway. A brief caveat, I'm not actually a huge fan of a traditional structure, as you may know if you've spoken against me in the past year. But that hasn't always been true. For my first 2 years, I spoke according to the structure Zainab taught me because Zainab was the god of debate for the first for several years of my debate career. I think that using structure and understanding structure is fairly important to being able to break away from structure. And also there's like a huge transition period in which you're bad at debate again whenever you stop using structure, because structure is really useful for judges. So at the bare minimum, you need to use it at some point in time for a period of time in order to get the concept of structure deep set into your bones and into your soul. And secondarily, it's always going to be useful. Like there are still rounds that I lose and I'm like, if I just headlined more, but I decided to stop doing that last January. So this is entirely on me and my own fault. Also, even speakers who don't really have structure still have the underlying bones of structure, right? Like if you think about a Dylan speech, a lot of Dylan's very rhetorical speeches seem as though they don't have a bunch of structure. But when you start to break it down, if you were to track Dylan's speech like the judges do, the reason Dylan places well is because there is an underlying structure that is followable, that is critical and crucial to them being able to operate in debating. Cool. The table of contents. There will be 3 parts to this. Firstly, prep time, because your structure starts whenever you start talking to your partner. Because if you get your structure wrong in prep time, it is very, very, very difficult to recover. And then we're going to talk about firsts, which Wordon assures me is very formulaic. I have consulted with various people on how to speak firsts and, got some personal experience this weekend just so that I could teach this workshop, and definitely for no other reason. And then we're going to talk about seconds. I think the tricky part of structure in seconds is being able to integrate responsive work into a formulaic structure. This is the reason why first speeches can be more formulaic in the first place, because you don't have to be as responsive to the round. So we're going to focus on that. Let's do it then. Why does this matter? For judges, this is how judges track you. This is the things that they write down on their paper. The headlines that you say are the things that they say in DLib. And if they can't find that particular piece of analysis that you said that was really, really crucial, whenever you're asking them questions after the fact, they might have even brought up that piece of that piece of analysis in DLib. But if they couldn't find it on their paper in order to prove to the other judges that you actually said it and they didn't make it up and they're not being insertionary, whenever a CA is watching them, they're going to roll over. They're not going to fight for you. They need to be able to find your analysis in order to justify their call to other judges. So you have to structure your speech in a way that they can find that analysis. It needs to be in a fairly intuitive place, and it can't be like the piece of mechanism that's really critical to the first argument is the second to last thing you say before the bell rings, unless you flag that that's explicitly what you're doing because you've made a mistake and you forgot, because otherwise they just won't be able to find it, and that will seriously screw you over in terms of adjudication. And it's also how they do the OA. I think a good check on how strong your structure is listening to an OA. Because if your structure was really good, the judges say what you said. And that is like the best feeling in the world, because it means you got it right and it means you've been communicating effectively. But if the judge's summary of your speech, as long as they're a good judge, is not quite exactly what you said, or they're putting things together in a different way, firstly, it's probably a better way to put it together because they've had more time to think about it than you did whenever you were just speaking off the cuff. And maybe you should copy that and use some elements of the way that they're restructuring your speech to think about how you should structure speeches in the future. But secondarily, you also just haven't done your job. So you probably should think about where your critical failures are and where you have weaknesses in structure. The other thing that this matters is for you, because this is how you avoid forgetting things that you said in prep, that you said were really important in prep, and then you didn't say them, and that lost you many a round. It's also how you avoid missing burdens, because I think at least I struggle to identify burdens until I've talked through an argument, and whenever I'm talking through that argument in the way that I'm going to present it, then I start hitting the point where I'm like, oh, and I do have to prove that prestige matters in the first place, or something along those lines. So it's a way to avoid missing burdens in your own argument, but also a way to find extensions in other people's arguments if you're in back half. Always organize each section of your speech in order of importance. I say always, I don't always do it. Every time I don't do it, it's really disappointing for me because you never ever get through your entire speech. And if you do, then you don't have enough content. Realistically, most people never get through their entire speeches, which means that you need to have each section in a collapsible format. If you're taking too much time on something, you need to be able to move on without missing something that's critical, which means that you should probably be organizing each section of your speech, most important mech to least important mech, most important argument to least important argument. I did that a couple times this weekend where I just cut off entire arguments that we talked about because they were the least important one anyway, and I needed to spend more time on the other things. And I was able to do that because they were at the end, so I could just drop them. This is probably fairly important in terms of internally to your structure, because note that it's each section of your speech. It's not just put all of the irrelevant stuff at the end of your speech, although you can do that. It's internally to each argument. If you have 3 mechanisms, your strongest mechanism should go first. I've had a lot of arguments with other people and also with judges about this, but the general consensus that I've come to talking to people is that your strongest mech should go first under any circumstances, even if you're trying to hide weak mechanisms in the middle for some reason. You should still put your strongest mech first and your second strongest mech last. Don't save the best for last, because at that point, the judges have realistically tuned out and they're not listening to you anymore. Okay, let's talk about prep time. Oh yeah, on prep time very briefly, this is probably going to rehash at least some of what Leonda taught you on Monday, but that's fine because this is a different way to think about the same concepts and the same topic. Okay, what's this? This is a way that some people do prep time, and this is a way that I think is really interesting because no one in the union that I know of does it, so I'd like to talk about it really briefly as a way to approach prep time. This is Joe Mayes, I believe. This is a very strong debater from several years back. You can find his article, How to Break It an International, I think, or How to Break It a Major, online very easily. It's really useful and has good content in it. But the way that he does prep is he prints off these sheets, and he has one for every round, and he preps on this sheet every single time. The reason I think this is interesting for structure is a few things. The first one is it means that he always knows exactly like where things are on his page, which is a problem that I know I have, and I think a lot of people have whenever they're taking notes. They just kind of jot down ideas and they end up sort of scattered, and then you lose that mechanism that was important because you wrote it down at the beginning and the rest of the argument it connects to ended up at the end. I think that a way to solve this is to have a fairly solid structure of how your prep sheet is laid out physically, like where you're putting things and when you're thinking about things. So that's a way you can use this. The other thing that I think is important about this is just that I think it's an interesting way to make sure you're always hitting burdens. What he's done, and he recommends in the article that you like make your own and use your own questions and that you shouldn't copy this wholesale. But what he's done is he's picked out all of the things that he's bad at, the things that he tends to miss or that he makes mistakes on. Like even down at the bottom, you can see these words that he's written that are like critical words for him to remember when he's debating: calm, slow, reasonable, hand on arm, feet, eye contact. These are the things that he specifically needs to remember in order to make sure that he's like giving a speech that is comprehensible and clear. I think starting off your prep with a clear understanding of what you're doing and what you're aiming to get across in terms of your attitude, in terms of the arguments you're making, and in terms of the things that are important not to forget is probably fairly important. Just because no one in the union does it, I thought that was maybe useful to look at. I'm going to talk through the rest of prep time as though you're writing on blank sheets of paper, because that's what I do, but like insert your preferred method of prep here. If you're using a laptop, you can use different sections of the laptop. I know IL uses 2 different screens of a laptop, so he's got one screen in which he types one set of thing, and the other screen in which he types his speech. So one screen's for like notes and flowing and something like that. You can split screen your laptop and use 2 different documents, and I think that's a fairly valuable way to do it. But let's talk about 2 sheets of paper. I think that the way that you use 2 sheets of paper in prep time is one sheet is for ideas and things that are said. This is going to be the really scattered part of prep, right? This is going to be where you just kind of throw everything down during silent time, or maybe whenever your partner is just starting to talk. You should also be note-taking while you and your partner are talking. I know that whenever I forget mechanisms that are important, it's always because I was too busy talking about them to actually write down the keywords I needed to remember to write them down whenever I was writing my argument. argument later. So I think that it's fairly important that someone, probably the person who's giving the substantive argument, is taking down the critical points of substantive, and someone is taking down the critical points of response. Like if you have any preemption that you're talking about, or maybe you're preemptively discussing how to weigh one argument over another, a thing I know I like to do in prep time, you should probably make sure someone is writing that down, probably the second speaker in that case. What I would recommend here is you should probably group each argument into a different part of the page. So what my prep notes end up looking like is kind of a spider web, because I have like a circle and then like no circle, but there's words down here that are a separate argument altogether. And the reason I think that's important is because if you just use the whole page, you don't have to end up in that situation where the thing at the top is actually relevant to the thing at the bottom. And you're better able to draw lines and arrows and just move things around, so you don't have to worry so much about forgetting and finding, because I think prep time tends to be fairly panicked and you tend to be pretty short on time. So it's important to make sure that you can find everything that you've talked about. I'd also note you can flag things that need expansion. You don't have to write everything down in the thorough way you've talked about it. That's for the second sheet, which is the one that you speak off of. I would recommend in general that you probably never should be trying to speak off of your prep sheet unless something has gone very badly wrong for you and you've completely run out of time, because it's too messy, it's not very well organized, and it is just going to lead to bad structure. This applies whether you use a laptop or if you use a piece of paper. I think if you're using a laptop, you should be substantially moving things around, because no one talks in prep the same way that they want to give the speech. There are different burdens that are being missed that are then filled later and stuff along those lines. So you should separate these things out so you don't get confused and you don't get lost. On the one that you're speaking off of, I'm going to do this in the reverse order that I've put them on here. Leave space to fill in mechanisms as you think of them. I have seen all of the second year's notes, and basically all of you do not leave any space ever. It's really, really, really important to make sure that you're leaving space to fill in burdens and to fill in mechanisms. The first time you write out an argument is not going to be correct, and it's possible you won't even realize it's not correct until you're in the middle of the debate and someone else says something and you realize that actually you do have to fill that burden, which means you need to leave space to fill it, because otherwise it's going to be on a different piece of paper. You can forget that piece of paper, you can bring it in at the wrong time. That would be honestly quite devastating to your structure. The other thing I would say is make sure you're working on the important things first. So like you can lay out your headlines, and then you can actually fill in the analysis for the things that are fairly critical. Tom?
If you're a second speaker in prep, what are your thoughts on, like, so you have your prep sheet and then you have the sheet that you're actually delivering your speech on. What are your thoughts on how much you should put on like your final speech sheet during prep, like say you're like reacting an argument or like things of way, or should it all be on like a prep sheet and then you can transfer it on to make it specific?
I would say it depends on the round. Like I do just think sometimes, so what I do if I'm writing something specific out in preemption during prep as a second speaker is I'll put that on a separate piece of paper altogether. So it won't go, and I'll put the idea on my prep sheet, but the full out written out analysis, the preemptive weighing or the preemptive like mechanisms and such are on a different piece of paper entirely. Because I can bring that up with me to speak without getting confused and without getting lost of all the other cloud of ideas that exists on the page that I was prepping on. I would split it out that way. And then sometimes you never use that piece of paper, and that's fine. You just leave it on the table. Don't bring it up with you. And sometimes you do, but it's easy enough to add another sheet without screwing up your structure. I think it's very difficult to add part of a sheet, which is why sometimes you'll see me like fold up pieces of paper. That's what I do if I've really made a mistake in prep and I've put something on a piece of paper that I only need half of the piece of paper for. I'll fold it over so I can't see the things I'm not talking about. Because it really seeing the things that you're not supposed to talk about does actually distract you quite badly, I think. Yeah, okay, so that's a way of managing prep time, but the important takeaway for structure that comes from prep is that you should probably be making sure that you are splitting up your cloud of ideas versus your actual clean written ideas. Yes, Danny?
At which point in time during like prep and then the round are you writing each one of these?
Yeah, I would say word cloud is happening at the very beginning of prep. I think this probably doesn't continue all the way through prep. First speakers can check me on this one, but I would say probably 7 to 5 minutes, depending on how long you leave yourself to write a speech, is when you should be transitioning fully to the other one. What I do in both firsts and seconds is I abandon the prep sheet whenever I start prioritizing arguments. So whenever you've gotten to a point, which is, I think, my next slide. Yes, more or less. So I'll just transition into there. The next slide directly is the motion for the next thing I'm going to be talking about. So the motion for this is, this also poses the prevalence of non-field academics commenting on current affairs in mainstream news media, e.g. archaeologists quoted to support Brexit, historians quoted to support multi-gender bathrooms. This is at Aberdeen this weekend, so I just took exactly what Alex and I prepped on government side. So at some point, you need to organize the ideas that you had in prep. And this is whenever I think you transition from the word cloud prep sheet over to a clear, organized list of, here are the things that we are trying to prove, here's the analysis that underpins it. And you should probably move it into like an ABC 1, 2, 3 prioritization of the things you want to run and the things you think are important to run. This is so vibes-based in terms of how you do it, when you do it, in terms of like what you find to be important. The order that I have these things is the order I wrote them down in, but it might not even have been the order I believed at the end of the round, or perhaps not the order I believed now, which I haven't looked at, so it might or might not be. This is like extremely, extremely vibes-based, but you do need an order that exists, because this helps you and your, like both you as a first speaker and you as a second speaker understand what's happening, which means you can do a few things. As a second speaker, it means you can write rebuttal that is like somewhat complementary to the analysis you think you're going to give, because fairly soon into the PM speech, if you're closing government, you should probably know which one you're angling towards, or maybe you'll know which ones you aren't angling towards, and therefore what you can't use. So I think a lot of responsive material is just weaponization of positive parts of your own case. So you can do this better whenever you have a clear idea of what you're going to do. But if you have both the B and the C here, if you have both, what does this change about how people behave, and do people even value prestige at all? If these are both ideas you think you could run, they're completely contradictory ideas, and the kinds of responses that you would give if you're running one case is probably very different from the kinds of responses you'd give if you're running the other case. So having an idea of which one you're more likely to run helps you write material that's less likely to be useless, probably, which is, I think, fairly helpful. Especially because as a second speaker, because you're both flowing and also writing responses, you don't have a lot of time to waste time writing something completely irrelevant in the middle of rounds. I don't think anyone has time to waste time in debate, to be honest, but second speakers really should not be writing responsive material that turns out to be completely irrelevant if it can be avoided. This is one way to avoid that. The other way that this is helpful is it just tells you what things you don't know. Whenever you write this out and you write out the claim and then the questions that are under the claim, which is sort of how I wrote this out here, and then, pasted it into Google Slides, you know which of these questions you either don't know the answer to or you need help with the answer to. So you can focus your energy and prep whenever you've got access to a second person on thinking through these kinds of critical questions, and thinking through what mechanisms you might give in order to prove each of these things. And you can do this on a priority basis. You know you're more likely to want to prove this, but maybe you think because you're closing, you feel fairly confident opening's going to run that, so you're going to focus on B and C instead. Or maybe you find A really intuitive, so you don't need to spend time thinking about it. Once you have this clear order of prioritization, it's just easier to work out how to spend your time and how to prioritize your time. But then once you have this structure, or once you have these orders of ideas, you can spend time thinking about your structure in prep as well. You can spend time thinking about how each case interacts with another case. As a second speaker, you can do that preemptive weighing thing that we were talking about earlier, where you talk about why might C actually be more important than A, and you can brainstorm on that concept. Also as a is there a point there? Yeah. But also as a second speaker, you can just have a clear idea of where analysis is likely to be needed, and therefore where you ought to spend your time filling gaps because you think that there might be a gap in X place. Okay. This is an exercise. This is literally just a 10-minute prep, like a motion prep. But I want you to try and prioritize organizing your thoughts and your cases into like a one-sentence description of the case that you might run under that heading, and then whether you think it's good or bad or how it places relative to the other cases that you have. Be ready to explain the things you found tricky or the cases that you have, because this is part of the audience participation portion of the game. Going to divide you into people because you guys are too clustered. Cyrus, can you speak with Zoha? Tom, can you speak with Navia? Nuan, can you prep with Freya? Zainab, can you prep with Danny? Ruby, can you prep with Owen? Max, can you prep with Mackenzie? Alex, can you prep with Josh? Leonda is not yet assigned. Who else is not yet assigned? Helen and Tamor and Gordon. Okay. Leonda, can you prep with Tamor? Helen, can you prep with Gordon? Actually, I mixed that up. Leonda, can you prep with Gordon? Tamor, can you prep with Helen? Let's do that. Cool. Everyone have your partners. Cool. So just to go back over what's happening here, this is a 10-minute motion prep. The theory behind that is probably you're spending 5 minutes writing anyway, so that's not part of the motion prep. Your priority is organizing your thoughts and your cases. Everyone is on Gov for this motion prep. Cool? So no need to worry about extending. You're not closing government, but I want to know what your thoughts and priorities are as opening. This house believes that it is morally legitimate to have children.
Like, if someone hates their life so much they commit suicide, it's really easy to do not a very bad thing. And then for it was already and then like I think that is like oh no, it's not like it's not that it's mentioning that I think suicide argument doesn't work. It's just not like essential suicide. Well, yeah. You put in like so people may not be using stuff. That's essentially right? Also then like why and then it doesn't have control, so it's have control, and I don't I think that maybe it's really good. Like, what's real nice way to why is the active morally positive one children? Yeah, maybe it's not way too yeah, maybe even frame that on so what do you think?
Everyone got so quiet at such an interesting point. It was like 15 seconds before the end of time. So that is time. Does anyone want to volunteer and tell me what their top ranked argument that they and their partner came up with? Josh.
Continuity.
Okay, justification. Just like super briefly, like explain it in a little bit more depth.
Like
Yeah.
actually this very on this news way, right? Certainly.
That humanity will continue if you have kids. Brilliant. Does anyone have an argument that they ranked above that, but they had that argument on their sheet? Yes, Rodel? Is that a no or a yes?
I think the best argument prioritizes life is good, as that's both the prerequisite for the continuity of future humanity, because if it's not good, then we shouldn't continue it. And it's also the prerequisite for the agency clash, or if the action brings about negative utility, then there's strong moral reasons to not justify the action. So I think if the action, if we just prove life is good, that also preempts the strongest push as well, which is just, it is morally illegitimate to have children, because that brings about more bad things to the world and child itself.
If Rodon runs life is good in opening government, how are you positioning continuity of humanity in closing government? Assume he doesn't touch it.
Life is good is a better now.
Yeah, but like how would you position it, right? Like what would your structure be in order to respond to that functionally?
Life is good, more people have life. More just.
Nice, brilliant. Does anyone want to volunteer and tell me what they found more difficult about, or go ahead, Tom. You have a thought on something else.
Priority, which is a more preemptive argument, which explains if you're coerced into doing something, then that choice can't be morally illegitimate. And then just explaining why parents are coerced into doing, like having children in all instances. And then that's way more preemptive, I think, than the other claim, because that's like basically the claim about whether life is good is the entire debate. But you can sidestep that whole clash, which basically the entire alt case is going to be about, by just explaining like sort of via intuition, this is a fun choice to make.
Nice. Helen?
It's like a burden push at the top of the count.
Yes, go for it.
Like essentially clarifying that we don't need to prove that it's morally good, just that it's not morally illegitimate to have children. So that means that the rest of the focus of the prep time is being like proving that it's morally neutral to morally good to have children versus proving it's morally bad.
Yeah, and then that ties in quite nicely with if you were to run Tom's argument framing. Does anyone want to tell me something that they found more difficult about ordering arguments in this debate? Because I do actually think it's quite difficult to figure out what you're prioritizing here. Yeah.
I mean, I feel like this is the case for sort of any ethics debate, but it's sort of hard to, like, for me, understand how different ways of thinking about ethics weigh against each other. And so principal arguments may feel the most intuitive, but whenever I try to explain them, it's just like, oh, this thing is good because I think it's good. And there's no real way to explain it. And I think utilitarian arguments, like they're the ones that are easiest to explain. But if you look at it intuitively, they make less sense. I don't know if that's explaining it properly, but I don't know how to rank them.
Yeah, the like intuition push of like, I just kind of believe this is true versus the debatery, wankery, more people exist. Love you, Josh. Which I do actually think is like quite a strong argument in this debate, but intuitively I struggle to justify. We're done.
Yeah, just on to Max's point, it also means that when you're doing if you're trying to run on both moral grounds, you're weighing up and ends up destroying one of your own arguments. So you're kind of locked into a thing where you can either run one argument, but if you run that one argument close, it's probably just going to the other thing way above you. If you run both arguments, then if you're going to weigh one of your arguments, one is going to presuppose the other, or you just stretch yourself too thin, and then someone else just focuses on one point and weighs it against you. So it's like trying to prioritize, especially when they're contradictory to one another, it can be quite cool.
Lots of people have thoughts. Ruby, go for it.
I still think that different judges and different people have like vastly different intuitions about really principled pushes. So sometimes you'll give like 4 minutes on something, and at the end we'll be like, yeah, but like I just don't really buy it. How do I combat this, and how do I make sure that my principles are like playing into what the judge's intuitions are, or what the other people in the room's intuitions are? Keep weighing that.
Tom?
I guess maybe I'm just explaining what's already been said, but I think there's a question about whether this is good for the child, but also whether this is good for society writ large. And so the sort of different weighings you do depends on which one of those arguments you prioritize. Because even if it was beneficial to society, would be it's fine to instrumentalize people so long as that has utilitarian benefits, and then vice versa for the other clash. And so I think you can probably win on both, but just depends which one you want to prioritize.
Owen?
Yeah, I don't think you even need to win either of those. You could just say it's sufficiently good for you, that it's okay. Whereas showing that people are actually coerced into doing this, I think is quite difficult unless you're committed to saying people are coerced into doing everything they do. But I think the similar arguments would get into the fact that having children makes your life way, way better. And so like, even if it's a bit bad, obviously it can't be a complete disaster for everyone else including the child, but like you don't need to outright win on those, provided that you have like some explanation or instruction as to why it's okay to make people worse off sometimes.
Serious.
Sometimes our arguments intuitively are contradictory to each other, so it's hard to figure out which to run. I.e., if you want to run utilitarian stuff about why it's valuable for an unborn child, and then also you want to run arguments about why unborn children are actors that we can't have any preferences for because they're subsumed under the bodily autonomy of the mother, things like that. You can't run both of those things, so it's hard to.
Yeah. Josh, go for it.
Sure. One other thought we had is there's like every decision you take. I know there's like debate responses to this, but like truly just the choice to have a child is a legitimate one. This is a choice you've made for yourself.
Yeah, very much so. I think all of these are like fairly interesting arguments, and I think all of them are debate winning arguments depending on the way that you run them and the way that you structure them, and also what responses are given. The reason I think that this one is interesting for structure is because I think that moral debates end up fucking disasters for exactly the reason that you guys have identified here, that you're trying to win on like a bajillion different metrics, and no matter what metric you do, someone's going to extend on a different metric, and then they're going to try and weigh that against you and things like that. That's why I think that having a clear understanding of your order of cases is fairly important in prep time, because if you could just narrow into your conception of the debate early on whenever you're working on your speech, then this means you can also justify your conception of the debate and have time to spend on justifying it internally to your partnership, because if you guys have a clear understanding of why this conception matters than any other conception someone could throw at you, that's probably going to give you the cleanest ability to then just make the arguments and not worry so much about that. And even if that, and need a flow diagram in order to walk a judge through it, which I think is always a little bit of a disaster. As someone who's once been draw a graph, because it just, they don't draw the graph and then it doesn't work. Okay, so that is prep time. Hopefully you can see why structure is helpful in prep time, how you can address structure in prep time, all of those things. That brings us to the next thing, which I need to make sure is set up properly on both of these because my notes are in the notes. So if you're ever looking at any slides I've made, all of the notes for my thoughts on how to run the workshop are in the slides, which are also linked, so you have access to everything. Okay, let's talk about the elements of a first speech. There are, I think, 3 elements that exist in a first speech. You have an introduction, where Don tells me that this matters. Cyrus also tells me that this matters. People keep telling me that this matters, so we're going to talk about introductions. Then you have framing and setup. I think the important thing on framing and setup is making sure you're not spending too much time on it, but it is still very important and valuable, so we're going to talk about how to unfold it into your structure. And then you have the proof concept of a first speech, which I think is what you spend most of your time on, just proving the shit and doing the ideas and having those conversations. Okay, Let's talk about the introduction. What does the introduction do? I think the introduction grabs the judge's attention. I think it prepares them for your argument, and I think most importantly, it positions your value in the debate. I think there are a lot of things to consider when it comes to choosing an introduction. As someone who very rarely gives one, but whenever I do, by God, have I thought about it. I think that it often goes beyond like literal signposting. It's the spirit of what you're saying, and it mentally prepares the judge for the tone of your speech. I think that a dramatic introduction and then a totally unserious speech proves to the judges that your speech doesn't actually matter that much, because the contrast between the two means they've set their expectations so high, and then the actual result is so low that they just don't like it, and they struggle to buy into the concept of it because they had very high expectations. On the reverse, I think that if you give a very like unserious introduction, we're done, and then an extremely serious speech, you don't win the hearts and minds of the audience, and everyone thinks that you're silly for trying to prove that communism is good. Because even though this is a case that you can run and win with, and no one really buys into the idea of it, because they're struggling with the contrast between your introduction and the content of your speech itself. Which means that I think that whenever you're doing an introduction, probably the most important thing to think about in your introduction is what are you doing with that introduction, not what sounds good, and not what is enjoyable. Which then brings us to our next exercise. I love these things. I think that debate is a logic game, but it's also a game of showmanship. I think that this introduction is your moment to be as showmanshipy as possible. However, I think that choosing the right introduction for the right situation is probably also important. You are closing opposition. The other three teams in this debate have been extremely rhetorically strong, but analytically weak. Your case is analytically strong and rhetorically weak. What is the value that each of these three different introductions can provide to you? Think about it for a second, then I'm going to pick on people.
Red laptop.
Yeah, you do. Mackenzie, what's the value to a rhetorical introduction in this situation?
I think it probably puts you in a like the judges probably view that you are able to do all the rhetorical stuff that all the other teams are able to do. Then you can also are able to back people on the coping that you're going to have like do your speech.
Yeah. I completely agree. What's the value to a funny introduction? Freya.
Assuming the rhetorically strong and the other three is not funny, the funny does.
No, it's dramatic. Let's assume it's dramatic.
But presumably it might set you apart, which means if the judges have been sitting there being like, oh, this is cool, but I don't care about any of this, and you set yourself apart, they're likely to maybe pay attention to somewhat a little more and actually at least, you know, listen to your arguments more.
Yep. Navya, what do you think is the value to a like 2 arguments traditional introduction where you're like, I'm going to do 3 things in this speech, and those 3 things are going to be?
I mean, I guess it sets it up for like the analytic stuff that you're going to follow it up with, and almost sets the tone for what you're going to do and how it's different than learning.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that in this situation, there's not necessarily a wrong decision to make, but there are different things that you're doing and different considerations you have to make depending on what decision you make, right? If you do a rhetorical introduction, you probably have to thread some amount of rhetoric through the rest of your speech because you know that you're not beating the other teams on rhetoric, but you're trying to show that you can play with the big dogs. If you're being funny, then this is a tension breaker and you need to acknowledge that, and then you need to get everyone to lock in again. If you're doing a 2 arguments, then you're just like, come on, guys, let's do the debate thing that we ought to do. I think Adam did a combination of funny and 2 arguments in this debate, which was the Durham final last year. Cool. That then brings me to the next exercise, which is a solo exercise. You're not doing this with any other person, you're just doing it yourself. This is the motion, and this is your argument. You're going to develop a 30-second, 15-second, however long you want it to be, but less than 30 seconds introduction for what you would say in order to position this argument. And you're going to do it by yourself. There are going to be 2 people who I pick on to give their intro or justify their choice. So make sure you actually do engage. The motion is this house regrets the narrative that settling is undesirable. And settling is staying in a relationship where certain needs are not being fulfilled, or you're making compromises in some aspects that you consider crucial to a relationship. The argument that opening government is running is that reaching for a perfect relationship makes people less willing to compromise and more likely to break up early on in a relationship, which means they never learn how to be in a long-term relationship. I don't think there's a wrong answer on style for this, but you have 2 minutes to come up with how you would position it.
Do you mean opening government?
Yeah, this is the argument you're making. You're just writing an intro for it. Good clarification. Okay. Alex. You get a choice here. You can either just read out whatever your intro was, exactly how you did it, or you can explain what you were doing and justify your choices. Like, what style of intro did you go for and how did you start?
Yeah, so I spent a long time just thinking about the argument itself, because I don't know, I think that in my intro, I would kind of go for something like funny yet relatable. It'd be something along the lines of like, I think in doing this debate, we've all had to like sort through our own feelings about like a relationship and breakups and whatnot. And if you haven't had to do that, then damn, you're lucky. Or something like that. And then I think that that could, I don't know, it's kind of a funnier way to start, but then transition into your argument.
Nice. Noan, what did you do? Okay, that does not count engagement. I will be circling back to you at another time. Zainab, what did you do?
So this is kind of difficult for me because I don't really think about introductions until I'm literally standing there, and then I just like whip rap for like about what I kind of wanted. So there's been very few speeches in my life where I've like preemptively decided what I'm going to say. So I don't really like. I guess I could give you my like thoughts on this.
Yeah, go for
I
it.
think probably what I would do is just like start off by explaining that like I don't know. Like to fall in love and to be loved is probably one of the greatest human experiences that you can have, and therefore, but also that love is unpredictable. You don't really pick who you fall in love with, and you don't pick every trait that person's going to have, and so you're always going to have to compromise on something in life, or else you're never going to get into a relationship with someone that you genuinely love. So it's better just to like say fuck it and make compromises. I don't know, something to that extent. Basically, I would just like drum up how much like love means to people and why it's important for people to be in relationships and why you never find someone that's perfectly compatible for you in every way. And then that'd be like the general gist of what I'd want to get across in an introduction, and probably like a very lovey-dovey Zainab way.
Yeah, I did pick that because I was hoping that at least one of the schoolies would have done a 2-argument style intro. But unfortunately, Zainab is too I love for that. However, that is still quite contrasting with Alex's more funny intro. I think both of these are valid. It's just a different way you're structuring and a different way you're styling and preparing judges to engage with you. That brings us to then framing. Once you've done your 30-second intro, it's time to chat about setup. Alex?
I just want to comment, like, I feel like they go for almost the same thing of like both trying to have people contemplate like what love's mean.
Yeah.
It's fine, just goes about it in like try to make them like reflect while, you know, trying to tell them what to think. Like,
Yeah.
I honestly think it just depends how much of like a lovely person you are. I'm happy being salty for the first 30 seconds of my intro. But like all the debaters would rather like skip the salty personal shit and like get onto the argument. So I guess it just depends.
And Cyrus would say something in Latin. Brilliant. So once you've done your intro, I think you move on then to your framing and your setup. If you have it, if it's necessary. If you don't have framing and setup, this is probably like maybe some degree of positioning if you're speaking in member, as opposed to if you're speaking in top half. Perhaps you've done that positioning in your intro. That's also a thing that I think is fairly common. But for more details on framing and setup, which I don't really care that much about, see Iman's full CT from 24-25 on playing defense for a deeper look at how framing can be weaponized. There's my infomercial. The trick here is, I think, not getting lost in the sauce. I think that you can't spend too much time on this. I think it's often a time sink. I think the easiest way to think about this for me is any work I do in framing, any other speaker can use and just co-opt, and then they don't have to do the work, which sucks for me because it means I've spent time helping them beat me. So I think just be careful about how much time you're spending on this, unless you're pulling an Iman, in which case 5 minutes is sometimes fine. Don't really know how. Then we move on to proof. I think this is where the every section has its subsection becomes particularly important. I think that you have, what is the claim? Why does this matter? How does this relate to the motion? Why is this claim true? You can literally copy paste those ideas and give a fairly competent speech in terms of analysis if you just answer those questions. But then each why is this claim true ends up having a subsection of structure in and of itself, where you're trying to make sure that it's all ordered and organized and fairly formalized as well. Basically, it's just turtles all the way down. I think the way that you look at proof and the way that you structure proof is just trying to make it flow logically, which I think is kind of a tricky thing to explain or teach or justify, so Radon helped me. This house would ban the consolidation of newspapers by a single entity. The old structure acknowledges the comparative problem, so like, in the world in which we don't do this, here's the problem that happens. And then an intro that frames how there's a meaningful difference in this problem through empirical examples. Then some rebuttal to stuff that opening opposition said, and then preemption to stuff that wasn't said but could have been said. And never knows, maybe that preemption has prevented it from happening. And then explaining why regulation doesn't work, and then impacting. And this is like fine, but it's not very logically flowing, right? Like even as I'm saying that, I'm stumbling over it because I don't quite understand how each idea and concept links to the next one, and it feels a little bit jumbled just to put it together. So Radon says if he gave that speech again, he would do it like this. He would start with an intro acknowledging the comparative problem, then the empirical claims, which if you look at the old structure, you can see how those two things might flow into each other fairly directly, because the comparative problem is illustrated by empirics. Then you would explain why regulation doesn't work, which is then a justification of why the empirics exist in the world. And then you would give substantive about why this changes politics meaningfully. This also flows quite directly off of the analysis you've had to give in order to explain why regulation doesn't work in the first place. And then you can do some auxiliary impacts. That's where your structure probably gets the most fluid, because this is around minute 5, and let's be honest, the judge is barely listening to you anyway. And then you can weigh and respond to opening opposition trade-offs with a focus on mitigation specifically in this round. This is like quite unclear, I think, but the thing that's important to remember is that whenever you're giving a speech, you're storytelling. So every claim and piece of analysis that you're giving is just another contribution to the story you're trying to tell, and the story you're trying to tell is why your argument is true. So if you just follow each claim to its, like, once you hit the end point of a claim, what is the thing that you are speaking about that best connects next, I think is the cleanest way to differentiate. However, if you're not doing a super fluid structure, you can bypass this thing entirely if you just headline really clearly. If you say this claim and then that claim and then that claim, you don't need the fluidity nearly as much. As long as you are marking the beginning of each subsection that we are talking about on the proof page with a headline that's like, and now I'm going to prove X thing, it's so much easier because you don't have to link it logically, because then the judges just know where it is on your page, and structure becomes easier in that way. This house supports a norm of embracing anger in public discourse rather than one of aspiring to dispassionate objectivity. Opening government says people with personal stakes in an issue are less marginalized when this norm exists. What are the burdens that you might need for this argument, and how might you structure one of them? Just go ahead and chat with whoever you wish next to you for about like 2 minutes.
Well, it's a bunch of people who are. And there's something about license like.
Zoha, what is a burden that you identified?
Like, why is it that things like people that have personal stakes are currently marginalized by engaging with their anger?
Cool. How would you structure proving that burden?
Like why, like, there are reasons why they might embrace anger, just like emotional engagement with an issue, and also like not having access to like things like media training or like other things that might make them more able to be objective and like how does this like influence the perception of their engagement with the issue.
That's, yeah, brilliant. Noan, what's a burden you identified, and how would you structure proving it?
So how normalization of anger helps even the playing field in public discourse. Part of the burden was to suggest why those who are personally invested in the issue are more prone to anger, and why when everybody is expected to have anger and passion, then their investment in the issue would not be unique or discredited as being like irrational emotion.
That's really interesting. Yeah. I think you sort of explained how you justify it. Do you have any additional thoughts on like how you might structure proving that?
Like how they would be viewed in public,
Mhm.
and how the perception of them would compare to other people who are less angry or less marginalized.
Brilliant. Leonda, burden and structure.
So I think that the burden we identified is why does the need to perform dispassionate objectivity stop people from engaging? And I think it's often just that the extent to which you feel a strong connection to the issue just means that you look at yourself, you see yourself speaking about the issue that is personal to you in this way, and it alienates you from your own opinions, and this just makes the process of that engagement something that you find deeply distasteful and unenjoyable, and so that leads to people finding the act of public discourse something that is unrewarding.
Yeah, makes sense to me. Anyone have any thoughts on that before we move on to seconds? Yeah.
I think there's also an illustrative burden to some extent to show how on the comparative with like dispassion being favored, people are treated to help to scale up the claim about like people being excluded and that kind of thing. And a lot of that's just explaining the way that people are treated, like if they're like being interviewed or those kinds of things through like examples.
Yeah. And then structuring those examples is obviously internally complicated, but you can probably just logically flow. And that's probably whenever you use your judge's response to decide whether or not something's proven. And if it is, then you move on. And if it's not, then you stop. Or at least that's what I would do. All right. The TLDR on first speaking is that you have an introduction where the purpose is to grab the judge's attention. Then you have framing, you set up what everyone else needs to function. Then you prove your argument, but you have turtles of proof going down there. You have to prove your argument and you have to make sure that you're proving each internal burden of your argument. The structure for all of that is relatively the same. It's just a case of keeping track of it and making sure it flows logically and makes sense, at least to you, because if it doesn't make sense to you, it's definitely not going to make sense to anyone else. Probably also preferably should make sense to your partner, because that's a great check on whether or not you've gotten into your head a little bit too much. Okay, let's talk about seconds then. This is integrating responsive work. I have one slide for this, and the reason I have one slide for this is because I've taught it so many times that I think I can spitball. So we're going to go that style for here. Starting with deputies, I think that there are 4 elements of a deputy that exist. I think the turtles of proof analysis still works here. You still have each section is internally structured the same way a larger section would be, but you have slightly different sections that you're talking about here. I think that for deputies, you start with rebuilding. And I think that you rebuild specifically the most critical content. That's what you ought to prioritize. This is the thing that your first speaker forgot to say. This is the thing that the other team responded to well, and you are no longer persuaded that your first speaker is correct. And that's where you start with rebuilding. I think that, and as far as intros go, I suppose they could be useful. I've never done one before. Have fun. Maybe I've done one like once or twice, but like you can work that part out yourself. Same introduction analysis applies. As far as this, I think that the reason that you start with rebuilding is to make sure that everyone is centered and focused on your case, because the idea of structure is to guide what the judge is going to be talking about. You want to start with that headline that's the reason that they're going to put you through whenever they're in an out-round deliberation, or you're going to start with that headline that hopefully is the words they're going to say in the OA. Because if you've done it right, that is going to be the words they're going to say in the OA, and that's where you're going to be able to start. You prioritize rebuilding those most essential points, and then you start to slide into your second prioritization of rebuilding, which also almost places you in weighing as well, which is positioning your case against any round or anything that could exist in the round. So that is direct and comparative weighing against the other top half teams specifically, where you're like, we proved this. They, in their absolute best case, and you probably should be fairly charitable to them here, prove that. The reason that this matters more is because of internal weighing mechanism number 1 that you choose to give. These are the traditional weighing mechanisms, right? Like longevity, like intensity, scale, but you specifically should explain why yours matters more than theirs if you're using different metrics, and you probably should also explain why you're better able to suit these than something else. I think once you're done there, that should be positioning yourself and also weighing more or less simultaneously. Then I think you move on to responding. The reason I put responding here is because I think that responding very rarely wins you a full debate whenever you're in top half. I think that it most often wins you top half, and then you end up outframed by back half because you haven't done the weighing or the rebuilding. It means that your case remains prioritized and remains clear and understandable to a judge. I think responding is also the place where it gets the most messy. Like I said, I think the thing that matters most for second speaker structure is having this like loose frame that you can fit things into, because you're going to have a lot of moving pieces in a second speech. You don't get to plan it out from prep. I know Tom asked me a question about a weighing that I've done in prep preemptively. I think I can count the number of times I've actually used something I wrote in prep on one hand, because most of the time I go into debates with just a blank sheet. So what keeps me on track in terms of structure is knowing that these are the 4 points I need to hit, or 3 points because I don't do number 4. Number 4 is optional. New content. This is like if you want to. And if you're giving new content, it should probably be structured the same way first speaking content is structured, the same turtles of proof. But the thing you have to do that's important here is explaining how it interacts with the other case you've given. Unless you're completely cutting and running for your first speaker, you think that either they've proven everything completely or they've fallen out of the debate. This is where you need to explain how these 2 pieces of analysis interact and why it's important that you're giving both. Because if you're giving both, you probably should be able to justify yourself. I think you start with that justification, and then you prove it exactly the same way that a first speaker would do, and then you probably weigh it as well internally, because no one gets to weigh it for you. That's your structure there. For a deputy then, I think you're rebuilding, you're positioning and weighing, then you're responding, and perhaps you're giving new content if you feel like it, and if you are, I don't know, we're done. In whips, I think that it's slightly different in that I've split out positioning from rebuilding, because I think that positioning is even more important in whip than it is in top half. Because in top half, you're positioning yourself against what? One other team? Like, there's not very much positioning that needs to be done. A lot of it is intuitive, and probably a lot of it's still standing from your first speaker. But in back half, there's a lot more moving parts, so it's more difficult to do this positioning in the first place, but also there's a lot more attacks on your positioning. You've probably gotten a benchway POI to closing government if you're CO that's like, and back half's actually completely derivative. This is when you justify why you're not derivative. Or maybe you've gotten some kind of POI that's like, this is completely off clash. The top half clash is the thing that matters. This is when you justify why that's incorrect, and actually the analysis your first speaker hopefully gave on why the top half clash is irrelevant and your clash is the correct clash. You do that again. Positioning then slides into rebuilding, but rebuilding is once again the same structured analysis in terms of like, here's the thing that was missed, here's the thing that was successfully attacked, here's why the attack is untrue, or here's why I can give new mechanisms in order to fill this burden. There is a case in which you flip those two things, and that is whenever you have missed something so severe that the other team has pointed it out and you think you are already out of the round. So that does happen sometimes, and in those cases, the first thing you have to do is justify your existence. So I call that defending the extension. And whenever that is like seriously a problem, there's a missing burden, or there's a successful attack that challenges your relevance in the round so substantially that you need to prove the case in order for the relevance to matter, then you'd flip the positioning of those two things. Then you do weighing exactly the same as you would in deputy. Then you do responding. It's so much easier to keep track of responding and keep it less messy in back half than it is in top half. Because in top half, you're trying to do one-off responses, but you only have one team to respond to, and also you have to take a POI, and you have to probably respond to the POI, and you have no idea what the POI is going to be. I think that's very complicated to manage. Thank God Amitai is teaching that and not me. He texted me last night. He's still locked in. Yippee. Responding, then, you have two options in whips. You've got more than that, but you've got two clear options that are easy to structure and easy to explain. You can do a team-by-team whip in which you explain each team and their position relative to you, the weaknesses in their case, and why those weaknesses matter. This is where you can't get distracted responding, because I'm sure opening government has said a million things that are untrue, but the only things that matter that are untrue are the things that weaken their case against your case specifically. So perhaps they have a premise in their argument that means they can't win top half, but that only matters if your path to beat top half is weighing over opening opposition, and you don't actually think you can weigh against their case unless it's destroyed. You can use these responses, but I think keeping the goal of what you're doing in mind is how you don't get distracted whenever you're responding on these team-by-team responses. Because otherwise it's very easy to be like an entire page of responses against OG and then forget to respond to everyone else. The way I would recommend structuring team-by-team is starting with your bench, because whether you're winning or losing your bench, as long as it's clear enough, I think that this is a thing that either happens or doesn't. It's extremely binary, and I think it's very difficult to substantially change after more than about 2 minutes of responses, if that. So the second reason I would start with this is because this flows directly from weighing. If you've been doing weighing on why your analysis matters comparatively more, this is also theoretically the reason why you're beating your opening, because they're not wrong. At least we hope they're not wrong. They're just incorrect about what matters. And so you can flow into that very cleanly. Then you respond to the other bench. There's two options here. You can either respond to the weaker team first, in which case you have to be very rigorous with yourself on time management. Don't waste time responding to the weaker team forever. Or alternatively, you can respond to the stronger team first and then sort of hope you're already beating the weaker team, because you're going to spend 45 seconds on it at the very end of your speech. And if the judges are the kind of judges that require you to do responses, you're screwed. So don't do that if those are your judges. There's not very many of them around anymore, but it is probably important to make sure that you do respond to all teams in at least a sentence if you're doing a team-by-team structure, which is then the harm of that structure, because sometimes you don't actually need to do that. Sometimes clash by clash is more valuable. Here, you'd say there are like 3 things that people argue on in this debate. So in the morality debate, I think there's 2 clashes that we identified, right? There's 2 clear-ish clashes that we identified. In the morality debate, there's the question of, is this beneficial to society and like externally? What are the external implications of this morality? So societal utilitarianism, but also like Tom's like more deontological, illegitimate or non-illegitimate thing has a societal implication, because the way that you weigh instruments instrumentalization or the way that you weigh deontological clashes is by extending out what if society didn't respect this deontology? What would the world look like in that scenario? So then you can clash all of those things under societal implications, and then you can clash personal implications. That's to you specifically. That's to your child specifically. What does it look like for them? You can split the debate up in that way. There's like a million different ways to split any debate up into clashes, which is why I think it's very difficult to split things up into clashes. And I think it takes mostly a lot of exposure to debates to start to pick out what clashes actually are. But if you're the kind of person who's very good at dealing with clashes, the way I would recommend is you start with your own clash and then you deal with the other clashes. So you start by justifying why your clash matters more than the other clashes, and then you can respond directly to arguments that are made within those other clashes in order to weaken those arguments. In terms of all of these things, the structure is just this frame, and then you make decisions based on what else has happened in the round. I think the same is more or less true for first speeches, but I think that it's a little bit easier to have a formula and a structure in a first speech than it is in this, because this is my platonic ideal of second speeches, and I think I've done this like maybe 10 times. Like, unfortunately, it just doesn't often actually play out like that. So as long as you're keeping the structure in mind, I think that you're better able to be structured whenever you're trying for it than you are whenever you're not trying for it. But at the same time, you've got to kind of let it go sometimes. Yes.
What would you say the difference between positioning and weighing is? Like, I often think that when I do it, it just comes out the same thing.
Yeah, so I think it can be the same thing. And in deputies, I think it often flows into exactly the same thing, which is why I put it next to each other. But I split it up in whips. And the reason for that is because I think positioning is, here is the theoretical value of our case, and weighing is, here is how we fulfill that value that I said was theoretically useful. That's how I split it up, but up to you to split it up in that way. Perhaps it works better for you to just flip those two all the time then, and always start with rebuilding and then positioning, or maybe always start with positioning and weighing and then do rebuilding. Max?
I have a question regarding deputies and new content.
Pause you on that.
Okay.
Tom, are you responding to Zainab, or are you asking a different question? Okay, so then Tom, and then we'll go to Max.
Usually when I do positioning, then it's about like filling a burden or an issue with opening up, like the opening team, and then weighing is just like sort of like generally like more moral grounds. So like if there's like a response which was given that your opening doesn't account for, or they don't prove something, then even if you run a new argument, then that's what I would say positioning is. And then weighing is just like more like abstract comparisons of arguments themselves.
Yeah. Max, question on deputies.
What tends to happen in deputy speeches for me, and this is completely accidental, this is how it happens every time, is as I'm writing responses to what OG is saying, or like what the other team is saying, a lot of my responses can, like, at the end of their speech, kind of be grouped into a new argument, which is just their argument flipped. And so a lot of my responding is basically just me.
That's a good thing, not a bad thing.
Argument. So how does that fit into that structure? Is that what?
Yeah. So that is whenever responding flows into new content, which is why they're next to each other here, because sometimes, and in an ideal world, always, but rarely, that would happen. I think it's a great skill to have, and I think it's important to definitely do that on purpose. But the way that I would do that is I would flag it as a response, analyze the flip of it, and then explain that means that we get their benefits. Even in their best case, they're just wrong, and therefore we've proven it. And we've proven why they're not just wrong, but also we've proven their argument for them. So if they care about that thing, or if they care about morality, that's great. We actually access morality better on our side of the house. And then I would do independent weighing on the back end, basically, of the flip, being like, here's why that might matter in the round. I would be careful with wording that. Don't weigh it above your own content, because that's obviously the thing you've spent more time on and the thing the judge credits to you higher. So don't be like, this matters more than anything else, but it might matter more than other things that exist. Cyrus?
Directly related to maybe structure in general, but something that happens with those types of flips sometimes is that people turn a response that proves the opposite in the same sphere as a flip. And actually, I'm just getting credited as counter-analysis, so the clash goes neither way. So the motion is, this house believes that such should be extreme, and the other team said, social movements shouldn't be extreme because in media, they'll get covered better if they're more nuanced and palatable. And you say, actually, it's better to be extreme. We can flip this media point by saying when you're extreme, it means that you're more sensationalist. You get more eyes drawn to media. So we flip this point, but you haven't compared why sensationalism matters more than palatability. And so isn't actually a flip.
Yeah, that's the last bit of weighing that's important to make the flip work. That's a great way of putting it. It's like in absence of this weighing, it's just competing analysis and the clash washes. But if you weigh why your analysis on proving it is more valuable than their way of proving it, or alternatively, why your comparative impact is more valuable than theirs, then that's how you're able to turn it into a substantive case. This is also how to win from whip if you're completely fucked, or at least how not to fourth. So, okay. Any other questions? Brilliant. I'm going to stop the recording and then I have a draw sort of, but we have some problems with it.